At sunrise, Kelvin Walton pulled into the underground parking garage beneath a sleek, glass-paneled building of Riverstone Partners, an investment firm located in the heart of downtown Minneapolis. The streets were still quiet, the sky tinged with a soft golden hue that barely reflected off the damp pavement from the night's drizzle. He parked in the reserved section, his section, just as he had done countless times before. The building hadn't changed. The logo above the entrance was the same. The smell of concrete and rain was familiar, and the lobby still carried the sterile chill of a place designed to impress clients rather than welcome people. But something in the air felt different this time. There was no specific reason for the sensation, just an instinctive awareness that he was not being seen the way he used to be. He stepped out of the car with deliberate composure. His suit was dark gray, freshly pressed, cut to measure. His shoes were polished, and in his hand he carried a leather briefcase, one he had owned for over a decade. It was not just a tool of the trade, but a symbol of the road he had walked, a reminder of boardrooms, late nights, closed deals, and the quiet but unrelenting pressure of leadership. Kelvin had earned his place in the corporate world not through favors or shortcuts, but through meticulous effort, consistency, and a deep understanding of financial systems. The company he led had not only survived economic shifts, but had grown under his stewardship. And yet this morning, none of that seemed to matter. Inside the lobby, the lighting was soft but artificial, diffused across polished floors and minimalist furniture. A large vertical screen cycled through corporate announcements and market updates. Behind the front desk sat a young woman named Lauren. She typed steadily on a keyboard, earbuds discreetly tucked under her hair, her attention fixed on the monitor. Kelvin approached with calm assurance and stood before her for several moments before she finally glanced up, her expression blank. He greeted her politely, introduced himself, and handed over a folder containing notarized forms related to the transfer of significant investment assets. There was no recognition in her eyes, no flicker of acknowledgement that the man standing before her was the CEO of a major stakeholder in their firm. Lauren asked, without looking at the papers, if he had an appointment. Kelvin explained that he was there to oversee a scheduled transaction regarding corporate fund reallocations, a routine visit he had made multiple times before. Her brow furrowed slightly, not in concern but in detached confusion, as if trying to place him in a system that didn't quite accommodate exceptions. After a moment, she nodded curtly and told him to wait. He took a seat by the wall of glass overlooking the plaza. The chair was uncomfortable, but he remained composed. People passed through the lobby, well-dressed professionals, delivery personnel, clients with briefcases and designer bags. Some were greeted with warm smiles, others with knowing nods. The receptionist's tone shifted for each guest depending on their attire, their posture, their air of importance. Kelvin watched this quietly. No one made eye contact with him. It was as though he were invisible. Time dragged on. 10 minutes passed, then 15. At 20 minutes, he glanced at his watch, not impatiently but with a practiced awareness of time's value. It was then that a uniformed security officer approached from the far corridor. His name tag read Chris Peterson. He was tall, broad-shouldered, a white man in his late 40s with the stern look of someone used to asserting control. He addressed Kelvin in a tone that hovered between formality and suspicion, stating that without verified clearance, Kelvin would need to exit the building. Kelvin rose slowly. There was no anger in his movement, only disbelief that asked no questions. He explained who he was, again. He referenced the office's records, the appointments, the transactions. But the officer's stance remained firm, his eyes scanning Kelvin not for truth, but for threats. There was a pause, brief but heavy. Then the same words were repeated, this time with a sharper edge. The message was clear. Credentials were not enough. Presence alone in this context had become an anomaly. Kelvin remained still for a second longer before gathering his things. Around him, the lobby continued to function in quiet efficiency, untouched by the moment. Yet for him, the space that had once represented professionalism and trust now stood as a reminder of fragility, how even earned status could be erased by the simplest act of being overlooked. When Kelvin calmly but firmly refused to leave the building until the matter was resolved, the air in the lobby thickened. His words were met with silence from the front desk and tension from the nearby staff, as if his insistence was an act of defiance rather than a request for clarity. Chris Peterson, the security officer, did not hesitate. Without raising his voice or calling for assistance, he reached out and grabbed Kelvin by the elbow with a grip that brooked no discussion. The gesture was forceful, deliberate, and final. It was not a request, it was an enforcement. Kelvin's body reacted before his mind fully processed what was happening. His feet shifted, his balance wavered. As Chris pulled him toward the doors, their polished soles echoed against the marble floor, a staccato rhythm that drew glances from those nearby. Conversation slowed. A woman paused mid-sentence at the reception desk, her eyes briefly tracking the scene before flicking away. A man in a tailored navy suit looked up from his phone, expression unreadable, then turned his back, feigning interest in the abstract art on the wall. No one moved to intervene. The unspoken rules of corporate space were clear. Discomfort, no matter how obvious, was not cause for engagement. They reached the entrance quickly. The lobby's climate-controlled air gave way to the chill of the morning, seeping through the glass. Chris pushed the door open with one hand and guided Kelvin toward it with the other. As he did, Kelvin stumbled. Not because he resisted, but because the sudden momentum shifted his center of gravity. His briefcase, still gripped in his hand, struck the edge of the doorway and slipped from his grasp. The leather fell to the sidewalk with a dull thud, and the documents inside, carefully organized files, account authorizations, notarized statements, spilled onto the concrete like debris from a minor wreck. No one inside moved. Behind the tinted glass, the receptionist resumed typing. A junior associate walked briskly past, eyes locked on a tablet, ignoring the scene a few feet away. Chris made no effort to help. He stepped back into the building without a glance, the heavy door swinging shut behind him with a hiss of finality. A moment later, the access card tied to Kelvin's corporate banking privileges, his government-issued ID, and a folded letter of authorization were tossed out after him. They landed at his feet, an insult disguised as protocol. Kelvin remained still for a long moment. Above him, the clouds hung low and heavy, the early light drained of warmth. The cold breeze slipped under the hem of his coat, threading through his sleeves and collar. He reached down slowly, fingers stiff against the concrete, and began to gather the scattered papers. The wind caught one sheet and sent it skimming across the sidewalk. He chased it without urgency, more aware of the silence around him than the paper itself. Each motion was dignified, but tinged with the surreal recognition that his presence had become a problem, that his status had not protected him from being treated like a trespasser. As he knelt to retrieve a folded document from under a metal bench, a pair of boots appeared beside him. Kelvin looked up. Another security guard had emerged from the side entrance. Ray Monroe, a black man in his early 40s with tired eyes and a posture that carried too much resignation. His uniform was the same as Chris's, but the way he stood made him look smaller, as if the weight of experience had pressed his shoulders lower over the years. Ray didn't say much. He didn't need to. He bent slightly, picked up the ID card from where it had fallen in a puddle, wiped it against his sleeve, and handed it to Kelvin with quiet care. His expression was unreadable, but his gaze held something familiar. Weariness, maybe, or recognition. As Kelvin took the card, their hands brushed for a second. Ray looked away and spoke barely above a whisper, lips barely moving. What he said was not a warning or a complaint. It was simply acknowledgement, born from repetition, shaped by patterns too consistent to be coincidental. Then he stepped back without another word and returned to the building. The door clicked shut behind him. Kelvin was left outside, the documents now secured again in his case. But the moment etched into his mind. The humiliation wasn't in being thrown out. It was in knowing that it hadn't shocked anyone. It was in the indifference, in the silence, in the way the institution he had trusted for years had turned its back in a single morning without explanation or apology. And somewhere deep beneath his practiced calm, something else stirred. Not anger, not yet, but a quiet understanding that what had just happened was not an anomaly. It was part of something larger, and it demanded to be seen. Kelvin stood near the entrance of the Riverstone Partners office, the chill of the early Minneapolis morning still clinging to his coat. The brief gusts of wind tugged at his scarf as he reached into his inside pocket and retrieved his phone. His fingers moved with practiced precision, not rushed or trembling. There was no panic in his demeanor, no visible trace of outrage. It was as if he were preparing for just another item on his schedule, a routine call amid the chaos. He scrolled through his contacts and tapped the name he had memorized long ago. Janet Langston, the firm's executive director and his longtime partner in the holding company. The call connected quickly. Kelvin kept his voice low, controlled, his words clipped but calm. He didn't recount the details. He didn't need to. He stated there had been an incident and that he required her presence immediately. The line was silent for only a second before she responded, and then the call ended. Whatever had passed between them in that brief exchange wasn't just information, it was understanding. There was no hesitation in her voice, no confusion. She understood the gravity. With the phone back in his pocket, Kelvin turned his gaze toward the large glass windows of the office building. Inside, the world moved as if nothing had happened. People walked past the reception desk, some smiling, others immersed in conversation. The artificial lighting illuminated everything with a sterile glow that made the space seem unaffected by the moment that had just transpired. To them, it was Tuesday, just another day. Lauren, the receptionist, sat upright at her desk, fingers dancing across the keyboard in a steady rhythm. Her eyes remained glued to the monitor, refusing to glance up or acknowledge the man standing just beyond the threshold. There was something mechanical in her posture, something rehearsed, like a person performing a role without deviation. Chris Peterson, the security guard who had forcibly removed Kelvin, was now stationed near the entrance, arms crossed and expression unreadable. Occasionally, he looked out at Kelvin through the glass, not with malice or apology, but with the cold detachment of someone who believed he had followed orders, completed a task, and moved on. His gaze lacked emotion. It wasn't contempt, it was absence. A dismissal not only of what had happened, but of Kelvin's place in the narrative altogether. Ray Monroe, the other security guard, lingered near a side wall further inside, partially obscured by a potted plant in a column. He didn't look toward the door. His posture was relaxed but not idle, as though his body had learned to remain alert without appearing so. His hands were in his pockets, his shoulders slouched, and his expression blank. But the slight shift in his weight, the downward tilt of his head, suggested something closer to resignation than indifference. There was nothing he could say, and even if there was, it likely wouldn't change anything. Whatever sympathy he carried remained unspoken, buried beneath years of similar moments. Kelvin remained outside, still and composed. Passers-by walked behind him, unaware or uninterested in the quiet standoff unfolding between a man in a long coat and a building that had just rejected him. A jogger glanced over briefly, then looked away. A delivery truck rumbled past, its exhaust fumes briefly clouding the glass doors before drifting upward into the gray sky. The city around him continued as if nothing of note had occurred. But inside Kelvin's mind, wheels turned. The initial shock had passed. What remained now was a quiet, focused clarity. This was not the first time he had encountered subtle dismissals or masked hostility. But this was different. This was public. This was targeted. And it was unjustifiable. He thought not only about himself, but about what it represented. How many others had been turned away, denied, disregarded in silence without recourse or witnesses? How many names had been left out of directories, faces questioned at front desks, credentials doubted without cause? This moment was no longer about the account or the paperwork, it was about principle. Minutes passed, each second adding weight to his stance. He did not pace, he did not make another call. He simply waited. With each breath, his resolve deepened. The cold didn't matter. The stares didn't matter. What mattered was that this wouldn't end the way they had intended, with him walking away quietly, erased and forgotten. Something had been set in motion now, and Kelvin Walton was not the kind of man who let things slide, especially not when the foundation of what had just happened was built on silence, complicity, and an institutional arrogance that had assumed he would retreat. He didn't retreat. He waited, and the building watched. 20 minutes later, a black sedan pulled over to the side of the road. Janet Langston stepped out, tall and confident, dressed in a dark blue coat. Her expression was not one of fury, but of unwavering determination. She walked past the security guards, flung the doors open, and entered the office. Kelvin followed closely behind her. Inside, a heavy silence descended. Lauren looked up, saw Janet, and turned pale. Chris straightened up as if realizing something, but before he could speak a word, Janet had already taken control of the room. Without raising her voice, every word she spoke carried the weight of a judgment. She informed everyone present that Kelvin was the founder and CEO of the partnership firm that had invested millions in the management of this office. She demanded answers. Why had he been thrown out onto the street? Why hadn't anyone even bothered to check the documents? Why had the decision been made based on nothing but a single glance? Her words cut through the tension like a knife, leaving the room stifled in uncertainty. Chris glanced at Lauren, but there was no understanding in her eyes, only fear. He could sense that this wasn't a situation that could easily be diffused. Janet's presence was overpowering, her calm, poised demeanor a stark contrast to the unease that had settled in the room. The walls, once comfortable and familiar, now seemed oppressive, closing in as the truth began to unravel. The decision to eject Kelvin, one that had seemed so justified in the eyes of the office, now appeared hollow, fragile in the light of the woman standing before them. Janet's words didn't just demand an explanation, they forced everyone to confront the uncomfortable reality of their actions. As she looked around the room, her gaze was sharp, assessing each person with calculated precision. There was no room for excuses, no time for hesitation. The situation was no longer about office politics or personal rivalries. It was about power and about holding those in power accountable. Chris and Lauren exchanged brief glances, both of them realizing the gravity of what was unfolding. There was no turning back now. They had misjudged the situation, and now they would have to face the consequences of their actions. But there was also a part of them that understood Janet's fury was not just for Kelvin. It was for the principle of justice, for the recognition of what was right. Kelvin stood silently behind Janet, his presence now amplified by the storm she had brought with her. He had been reduced to nothing more than a pawn in this game, yet here she was, reclaiming his place with a force that could not be ignored. It was clear that she wasn't just fighting for him, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked or underestimated in this very room. Janet's arrival had shifted the dynamics entirely. What had once been a quiet office was now a battlefield of will and determination. The stakes were higher than anyone had anticipated, and the resolution of this conflict was yet to unfold. The silence in the office stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Neither Lauren nor Chris could find the words to respond, their minds racing as the weight of the situation settled upon them. They had expected confrontation, perhaps some form of reproach, but nothing had prepared them for the force with which Janet had arrived and the demands she had made. Janet, however, did not give them time to gather their thoughts. With a calm authority that filled the room, she announced that their powers were to be suspended indefinitely. An internal investigation would be launched into the incident and the actions that had led to it. Her voice, though composed, carried a sharpness that cut through the lingering tension like a blade. Ray, who had been standing off to the side observing the unfolding drama, was called into the office. He had always been a quiet presence, a man of few words, but there was something about him that had earned the respect of those around him. It had not gone unnoticed that, despite the limitations he had faced, he had maintained his dignity throughout. Janet recognized this and saw in him someone who could rise above the chaos and the corruption. When the meeting was over, Ray was offered a new position, one that came with increased responsibility: Senior Coordinator of Security. It was a position that recognized his quiet strength and unwavering sense of honor. For Ray, it was an unexpected turn, but a welcome one. It was clear that his values aligned with Janet's vision, and this new role would give him the opportunity to influence change from within. As for the rest of the staff, the consequences were less clear-cut but no less significant. All employees who had been witnesses to the incident were required to undergo mandatory training. The training would focus on the prevention of bias and discrimination, addressing the deeply ingrained issues that had allowed the incident to happen in the first place. Janet did not mince words when she addressed them. She made it clear that what had transpired was not merely the result of a staff error, but rather a manifestation of a deeper, systemic indifference. It was an indifference that had allowed prejudice to flourish unchecked and had led to the mistreatment of someone who did not deserve it. And that, Janet stated unequivocally, would no longer be tolerated. The room remained tense, but there was an underlying shift in the atmosphere. The staff understood that this was not just a reprimand, but a turning point. The old ways would no longer hold sway, and the actions that had once been accepted or ignored would now face scrutiny. Janet's resolve was unwavering, and as she left the office, her departure seemed to mark the beginning of a new era. For some, it was a moment of reckoning, a recognition that the status quo could no longer continue. For others, it was a chance for redemption, an opportunity to change the culture that had fostered this toxic environment. But for all, it was a stark reminder that the consequences of their actions were not just immediate. They would echo through the future. The investigation that followed was thorough, and the results were damning. There were no shortcuts, no attempts to cover up the truth. Every misstep, every failure to act in the face of injustice was brought to light. The fallout was swift and undeniable. Those who had been complicit, either through negligence or active participation, faced serious repercussions. Some found themselves removed from their positions, others were reassigned, and a few were even dismissed from the company entirely. The ripple effect was felt throughout the organization, and a new sense of accountability began to take root. For Janet, the battle was not over. This was only the beginning of a much larger fight, one that would require patience, persistence, and most of all, a commitment to seeing justice done. The changes she had started to implement were just the first steps in a long and difficult journey. But as she walked away from the office that day, she knew she had made a difference. She had not just exposed the flaws in the system, she had begun to dismantle them piece by piece. The consequences of her actions would be felt for years to come. And though the road ahead would be hard, it was a road that had to be walked. Kelvin approached the desk once more, but this time, there were no obstacles in his way. The office, once cold and indifferent, now seemed to bend around him, as if acknowledging his place. The documents were handed over swiftly, without a word of explanation, and the money had been transferred, processed with the kind of efficiency that should have been there from the beginning. There were no more questions, no more hesitation. Everyone in the room watched him, their eyes filled with something different now, respect. But it came too late. He no longer needed their respect. He had long since realized that his worth was not defined by the opinions of others, nor by their fleeting gestures of acknowledgement. As he gathered the final papers, a sense of finality washed over him. He no longer felt the sting of injustice that had once burned so fiercely in his chest. The fight, the struggle, it had all been necessary, but now it was over. He had come through it stronger, surer of who he was. He didn't need validation from the very people who had underestimated him. They could look at him however they chose. Their perceptions were irrelevant now. What mattered was that he had reclaimed what was his, and more importantly, he had proven something to himself. Before he left, Kelvin turned to Raymond, who had stood by silently throughout the ordeal. He extended his hand, and Raymond grasped it firmly, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Kelvin wished him strength, knowing that the man had his own battles to face, though they were different from his own. But there was an understanding between them now, a recognition that they were bound by something more than the office they had once worked in. They shared a moment of mutual respect, even without the need for words. Then Kelvin turned slowly toward Lauren, who stood near the back of the room, her face a mask of tension and uncertainty. Her gaze met his, but she didn't speak. There was nothing more to be said. Kelvin's voice was calm, but firm as he addressed her. He didn't raise it, didn't lash out. There was no need. His words were simple, yet they carried weight. He reminded her that next time, all it would take was a glance at the documents. No more judgment based on assumptions, no more decisions made in haste. And he made it clear, politeness was not a favor, but an obligation. It was a lesson she would carry with her, whether she realized it in that moment or not. With one last glance at the office, Kelvin turned and walked toward the door. The quiet that followed in his wake was thick, heavy with the unspoken changes that had taken place in the room. As the door swung closed behind him, he stepped out into the fresh air, the weight of the past few days slowly lifting from his shoulders. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Kelvin took a deep breath, feeling the coolness of the outside world against his skin. He had come full circle. He had fought for what was right, for what was his, and now he was free. As he stood on the sidewalk, the noise of the city around him seemed distant, muted. It was a strange feeling, one he had not experienced in a long time. There was peace now, a quiet kind of satisfaction that came not from victory, but from the certainty of having stayed true to himself. He had faced the storm, stood tall in the face of injustice, and had emerged unbroken. It was a feeling of belonging, not to the office he had just left, but to something far more enduring. Despite everything that had happened, despite the betrayal and the struggle, Kelvin knew he had remained steady. He had not been swayed by the opinions of those who sought to undermine him. He had not been broken by the system that had tried to erase him. And in that moment, as he walked away from the building and into the unknown, he felt something he had not felt in a long time. A sense of peace, of knowing that he had not lost himself, no matter what had come before. For the first time in a long while, Kelvin felt that he was exactly where he was meant to be,